Today is Tuesday, November 14th, and this is William Michael of the Classical Liberal Arts Academy. This morning I'd like to share some thoughts for students. I'm not sure that they would be helpful to adults at this point in their lives, but I would say that the ideas that I'm going to share this morning are the most important ideas for young Catholic children to learn and understand, at least those who are living in America. One of the greatest dangers in our society is the tendency for people to interpret democracy in a way that suggests that there are all kinds of conspiracies and evils being pursued, and that Christians are victims in danger of these conspiracies. Christians could really ask for no better government than that of a democracy, because our mission is to go into the world and make disciples. And the conditions for that mission are much better in a democracy, especially one that protects religious liberty, than in any other kind of government. Certainly not in a monarchy where the king could be an anti-Christian and could simply command the silencing of Christians. We have no such restrictions on us in America. We're free to speak. We're free to write. We're free to evangelize. We're free to worship. And if we consider the public square to be a place where all the religions and all the philosophies of the world are on display for men to choose, if we actually practice the true Christian faith and preach it accurately and clearly, we should have success. Aristotle says in the Rhetoric that the truth always prevails. And the only time that the truth fails to prevail is when those who speak it do so in such a poor manner that it causes falsehood to appear to be better. So if there is any failure of Christianity in a democratic society, it's the fault of the Christians and not the society. And this is the situation we face today. Many Christians respond to the failures of Christianity, or their version of Christianity in modern democratic society, by imagining themselves to be persecuted, imagining themselves to be victims of conspiracies, imagining a democratic society that protects the freedom of religion to be against them. And if we would just think about it honestly, it doesn't take long to realize how ridiculous this mindset is, and yet it's very common. So I'd like to share some positive ideas that hopefully Catholic children can commit to, because if they do, they can enjoy a happy life in American society. First of all, Catholic children, Catholic students need to be thoroughly convinced of the freedom that they enjoy in America. They have to be freely convinced that no one has any right to silence their religious beliefs, to tell them how they're to live or what they can and can't do other than what is actually restricted by law. No one has the right to tell them how to dress. No one has a right to tell them what books to read, what books not to read. No one has the right to tell them they cannot pray where they wish, they cannot preach the gospel throughout their lives, and so on. They have the freedom to practice their religion in America so long as they do so within the boundaries of the law. And our country will protect that right. And students have to understand that, because they have to know that they're protected in America, that they're safe in America. And they have to know that the disapproval or criticism of individuals around them does not represent America. And those people, though they may threaten, they themselves will be found to be breaking the law. And America, as a nation, the government, the actual government, will protect us. And students need to learn how to live with that freedom. There's a certain level of courage necessary, but nothing remotely close to the courage that Christians needed to live with in monarchies, where speaking of the faith or even showing signs of the faith could cause them to be arrested, thrown into prison, or even at some times in history put to death. We have no such dangers, no such fears in our generation, and Christian children need to learn to live without those fears. They need to learn that if they go away to college, they have every right to speak freely as Catholics, to talk about their faith as freely as if they were in their own living room, but that they have to respect the views of others as well, and do so in a calm, reasonable, respectful way. That's a real challenge, and some people find that challenge so difficult because of their own lack of maturity, lack of self-control, and so on, that they feel as if they're being persecuted just to have their views questioned or disagreed upon by others. And Catholic students have to learn that disagreement is not an insult, it's not persecution, it's actually to be expected, because the Christian faith actually teaches that those of us who believe in the Catholic religion, those of us who believe in God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, do so not because of our own observations, not because of our own reasoning or studies, not because of our goodness, but because God has given us grace and has caused us to turn to Him and follow Him, to believe in Him. And many others around us in society have not received that grace, at least not yet. And the mission of the Christian life is to bring that grace to others, to introduce others to that same grace. So to find people around us who don't share our beliefs should be expected. The Christian mission wouldn't even make any sense if the people around us were all Christians. We go into a world where people do not know the truth, do not believe the gospel, are not living in the grace of God, and we're the ones who are supposed to introduce them to that grace, both by the lives that we live that they get to observe, and by the message that we share and the way that we share it. Catholic students have to learn that they are free to live the Catholic life. They don't need to go to a Catholic school to do so. They don't need to hide in Catholic communities to do so. They can do so in the greatest cities. They can do so at the largest and most prestigious universities. They can do so in the greatest companies and institutions, because in America, freedom to worship is protected by the Constitution. Now, if they're working for a private company or are involved in a private institution, that institution can have its own rules, and those rules are to be respected. But that's not persecution, because none of us have a right to any private resources. And our own commandments teach us, "Thou shalt not steal," which teaches the right to private property. And so we need to respect decisions and policies of private organizations and realize that to desire the benefits of private organizations is what it means to be covetous. So we're to respect the right to private property. If someone develops his own business or an institution is organized privately and privately funded with a certain mission and policies, if those private policies are opposed to Christianity, that's simply not a place for us. And if we set our hearts on those places or positions or resources, that's our own fault, because we should respect private property and not be covetous. But in general, at large, in public, whatever is public is open to all Americans, and we should represent Catholicism in those public spaces, respectfully, reasonably, patiently, but faithfully and comfortably. And Catholic students need to learn this. So you can see the worst thing that parents can do for their children is raise them with their heads filled with all kinds of talk about persecution and conspiracy theories, because that does not lead Catholic children to understand the society that they live in, and really it reproduces the weaknesses and character faults of the parents in the children. And this is done in many places. This is done especially in private Christian schools and homeschools, where this conspiracy talk and fear-mongering is actually used as a marketing device to encourage people to make use of private resources, private businesses, and so on. But that can't be what motivates Christian education. Catholic children need to be raised to understand all of the benefits that they enjoy in America. And I will testify, as a Catholic man, I will testify to the goodness of America for Catholics. For example, I'm 48 years old, attended public schools. Not that I recommend them, but I attended public schools. I attended public schools with kids from all different nationalities and backgrounds and religions. There were Catholics in my school, there were evangelicals in my school, there were irreligious people in my school, there were Hindus in my school, Muslims in my school, on and on. And there was never any religious conflict or discouragement anywhere. I attended a public university. I attended as a Christian. I had in my courses and in my classes and even in my college housing, students from every nation, every religion, every ethnic background, and they were all welcome. We were able to get to know each other, learn about our different cultures, learn about our different religions, discuss them, argue about them. We were free to do that. I actually grew as a Christian in a secular public university. The resources I used to learn the Christian faith actually came from the library at a public secular university. There was never a time when I was penalized or discriminated against for being a Christian. On the contrary, my Christian life and the virtues of the Christian life and the light that I received from the Christian faith helped me to thrive and win awards from the secular public university. After college, I enjoyed 20 plus years of professional work. There were times when I worked to organize schools and had to work with local inspectors and city councils to get approval for projects and things like that, and I never had anything but support. So long as I stayed within the bounds of the law, so long as I acted justly and respected the common good, any work that I ever pursued was approved, even helped by members of the secular government. There was never a time where I received anything but support, as long as I showed myself to be respectful, reasonable, and obedient to the laws. And even now, as an older man at 48 years old, I can study at a prestigious school like Harvard University, speak freely and openly as a Catholic, answer questions from a Catholic perspective, write papers from a Catholic perspective, discuss controversial issues with my fellow students as a Catholic, and I have nothing but support. Disagreement, but it's reasonable disagreement. It's expected disagreement. But most importantly, it's free disagreement. And so I just reject any suggestion made by any Christian that there's anything to fear in America. Like the old saying, the only thing we have to fear is fear itself. And those who are fearful, those who talk about conspiracies and persecution in America, really have no grounds on which they do so. And if you talk to them, it won't take long for you to realize that their message is grounded on fears and suspicions and conspiracies that they have no hard evidence for. And that's not how Christian people think or live. Christian students need to learn this. They need to learn, they need to be assured that they are free. And that if they do meet with any resistance, it's just a private, individual resistance. And they have the same right to express their own private, individual views as those do who disagree with or resist them. So there is a need for some personal courage. There's a need for some local courage. But there's no need for any political fear. There's certainly no justification for any thoughts about persecution. And Catholic students need to learn this. That's the first important lesson I believe Catholic kids need to be taught and assured of by faithful parents. Secondly, Catholic students need to learn that what makes them valuable to society, what will earn them rewards from society in anything that they do, is their own unique personality, their own unique gifts, their own unique interests, their own unique experiences. They do not make themselves valuable by becoming like other people. They do not make themselves valuable by becoming more like the average person. What actually makes them valuable is what's unique about them. And it's difficult for students to appreciate this. What makes a student great is accepting providence, accepting his or her lot in life, accepting the reality of his or her birth, his or her parents, his or her resources, his or her connections, opportunities, and so on, embracing them, understanding and appreciating them, and then living a life in light of them. There may be obstacles and disadvantages, but the individual works to overcome them. There may be disadvantages, but the student learns from them and shares them to enlighten others. The student discusses freely the obstacles and disadvantages he or she faces and demonstrates a life of virtue by overcoming those disadvantages, by filling in what's lacking, by his own study, by his own prayer, by his own diligence. And this is what makes an individual valuable to society. When students apply for college admission to the most selective universities in the world, the colleges are not concerned with their grade point average. They're not concerned about their SAT score. Those things are taken for granted by great colleges. Obviously, every student considering attending a great university will have good grades, will have a strong transcript, will have good SAT scores, and so on. But what the great colleges and universities seek are individuals who will enrich the campus, who will enrich the community at the university. They're looking for individuals who are different from the individuals who are already on campus. It's that diversity that makes the university experience so valuable. To hear arguments from people from different cultures, from different countries, from different religious communities, to hear them represent themselves rather than have a Christian tell Christians what Muslims believe, or to have a Jew tell Jews what Catholics believe, or to have a Protestant tell Protestants what Jews believe. In a diverse university environment, Christians learn what Jews believe by talking to Jews. They learn what Muslims believe by living with Muslims. They learn what Buddhists and Hindus, Protestants and Catholics believe by talking with them, living with them, getting to know different aspects of their lives, seeing what they have in common and what actually distinguishes them. And the diversity of that community is what makes the university experience valuable. The colleges are looking for individuals who are unique. And Catholic students need to understand that the things that make them unique, things that they're also often embarrassed of, things they try to conceal, those are the things that actually make them valuable. They've got to learn to be comfortable in their own skin. They've got to learn that what makes them different is what actually makes them valuable. As I said, most Christians, led by their foolish parents, attempt to become like the average student. They study what the average students study. They do things that the average students do. They're led by ignorant, popular knowledge about how to prepare for college, how to prepare for careers, and so on. The advice they receive is false advice. It's ignorant advice, and it actually leads them to do the opposite of what they should do. Parents are often upset because their children don't embrace the faith, not understanding that their children's discomfort with the faith is actually being caused indirectly, maybe unintentionally, by the parents' message about the world and pressure to prepare for success in the world. The parents are preaching to them and pressing on them one message and then expecting from them results that are actually contrary to that message. And so this problem is actually caused by the parents in the children. The children need to learn that what makes them valuable is actually what makes them different. So as I said, when it's time to apply for admission to a selective university, usually the universities will ask some controversial question and ask a student to respond to that question. And what they're looking for is something unique, something that will show a different voice to be added to the campus community. And what Christian students often do is think that their unique voice will offend people or will be persecuted or rejected because they've had conspiracy theories pumped into their heads their whole lives, and they write a vanilla essay that is exactly the opposite of what the school is looking for. What the school is looking for is a different voice, is a different perspective, a different insight. But what the school wants to see is respect for the views of others, the ability to disagree in a calm and respectful way, the ability to articulate one's own personal views with reasons and evidence rather than emotions or prejudices or false accusations. And so what many Christian families give their children is the opposite of everything that's good for them. The way that the children have been taught to think of the world with an evil, pessimistic view leads them to make prejudicial statements about others, leads them to make false accusations, leads them to be suspicious, leads them to assume that it's okay to assume that others believe things or do things that you have no actual evidence for. And that comes out in the writing. That comes out in the essay. And what it does is it shows that a student is not prepared to live and thrive in a diverse society. And it's not because the student is faithful. It's not because the parents are faithful. It's because the student has actually been prepared to live in a society that doesn't actually exist. And so the denial of that student is not persecution, but justice. And so what that student will do is end up in some isolated echo chamber, private college where only people who share their views attend, and the errors and faults of that student's education and life will be reproduced for another generation. What makes a Catholic student valuable is what makes them unique. Now, in our courses in the Classical Liberal Arts Academy, despite the reality that students may be getting a different message from their parents, the books we study teach this same idea. For example, in English composition, we study a textbook that teaches the art of composition, really excellent course that I recommend for everyone, even adults. But the very first lesson of the English composition course teaches why students struggle in modern school writing courses. And the author of this textbook explains that the reason why students struggle to write in modern school writing courses is because they're often given generic school assignments to write about, topics that they don't necessarily know anything about, topics that they're not interested in. And this is not how writing works. We're supposed to write about things we're interested in. We're supposed to write about things that we have experience in. We're supposed to write about topics that we have knowledge of. And therefore, what most modern schools do, because modern schools are part of the problem, they have this dream of creating 1,000 copies of what they consider to be a good student, which is actually the opposite of what a democratic society needs for success. The schools are part of the problem. The assignments are part of the problem. And the failure to write well is the end result. The schools, of course, blame the students, but it's the school and the way that they teach writing that is the cause of the aversion to writing. Our English composition courses teaches the kids that what makes their writing interesting is their own experience, writing from their own interests, writing from their own everyday observations, discussions, studies, and so on. And so in our composition course, every time the students are asked to write, they're given a variety of topics as suggestions, but also encouraged to feel free to write about a different topic with a focus on a certain skill in writing. And the composition course emphasizes this important lesson, that what makes you valuable is what makes you unique. And you should always focus on that. You should always share that. You should always understand that your unique experiences, your distinct experiences, are what make your voice valuable to the community. And if you choose to cover that up, or wash it away, or hide it, the community suffers because it lacks the insight from a different perspective, which you were supposed to represent, and which you should understand in God's providence you were designed to represent. You need to be what you are. That's what actually makes you valuable. That's what will allow you to thrive and help others. That's what will help you in business. That's what will help you in writing. That's what will help you in speaking, in education, in every area of your life. Understanding what makes you different and being comfortable to speak as you are and put your unique insights onto the table is what you need to do. And most students in schools, whether it's public schools, Catholic schools, home schools, they're actually taught to do the opposite. They're taught to look at life as a separation between church and state, a separation between family life and public life, a separation between religious life and secular life. And they shouldn't do this. Now, there is a need to be able to reason persuasively, and the rhetoric we use, the strategy we use to attempt to persuade others certainly needs to change when the audience changes based on their concessions and points of agreement. But changing the lines of argument we use and hiding our light under a bushel basket are two different things. It's one thing to change the lines of reasoning while you argue for your faith. It's another thing to neglect your faith or check it at the door and then to just argue nonsense. What makes Catholic students unique is what makes them valuable, and they've got to learn to speak freely, to be who they are. And it's my biggest challenge to get students to understand this, because I see it constantly. I see this pressure that's put on them to have a religion that distinguishes them, to live a life that distinguishes them, but then to be ashamed of it, to be embarrassed by it, to not talk about it when they're with others, but to try to act like everyone else. Like the saying, when in Rome, do as the Romans do, living like a chameleon, just moving from one situation to the other and changing the color of their skin. Democratic society actually asks them to do the opposite. But this is a wrong way to look at life. And it's common for Christians because they have distinctives. The things that they say will lead to disagreement, and they are not prepared to discuss those disagreements respectfully, patiently, reasonably, and so on. The failure of their education to prepare them to live as Catholics in a diverse society leads them to separate And they spend their life justifying their separation with conspiracy theories and unjust accusations and assumptions and suspicions against their neighbors, with whom they could live in peace if they were capable of doing so responsibly, respectfully, reasonably, and so on. Everyone knows that I argue with people all the time. Everyone knows that. But what's interesting is the only time that I am criticized nastily, spoken to disrespectfully, is when I talk with other Christian people. When I talk with modern American Christians, I get cursed at, I get called names, I get scoffed at. I never received that response. I never received that response when I was a kid in public school with my own personality. No one ever spoke nastily to me when I was a public school kid. I never had a fight as a public school kid. I had lots of friends, even though I was as argumentative then as I am now. I was very competitive, played sports, had my own opinions on things. But we argued. Even me and my friends, we argued. When I went to college, I was very clearly a Christian, a very zealous Christian. No one ever called me names. No one ever spoke to me disrespectfully. In fact, like I said, I was given awards and was respected by non-Christian professors and classmates. The university inducted me into their Phi Beta Kappa chapter. That was my experience as a Christian with unbelievers, with a diverse secular community. I worked, I studied, I was respectful, I spoke reasonably, and I was awarded and welcomed. The same thing happened through my professional career until I really started to get mixed up with Christian people, and the bad experiences that I've had have almost exclusively come from Christians who are very uncomfortable disagreeing. I've experienced slander in my life only from Catholics. I never experienced it in my life until I became a Catholic and received it from other Catholics. I've never been mocked or scoffed at in a discussion except from Catholics. I've never been lumped in with a group and labeled and argued against as a straw man except from Catholics. I've never had people talk about me negatively behind my back until I got into Catholic education and began working with Catholics. These faults and weaknesses are more present with Christians than they are with non-Christians in our society. What's developed in America among Christians is something like what developed among the Jews in the ancient world. They immediately suspected all outsiders as evil. If they heard a story of perversion or corruption, they assumed that everyone in the society was guilty of that corruption and perversion, and talked about everyone in classes, in groups, in generic terms, with labels, and not as individuals. And when the apostles came along, The apostles had to correct the Jews and tell them that the Gentiles, in fact, were more virtuous than they were. And we learn about the virtuous pagans in history, and the Jews would have had us believe that there was no such thing as a virtuous pagan. Until, of course, they got themselves in trouble, and then, of course, they appealed to the virtuous pagans to come and save them, as they did during the time of the Maccabees, appealing to the Romans and to the Spartans. But modern American Christians live like the Jews. They would have you believe that every non-Christian is practicing the greatest perversion that can be found on the internet. Every story of a murder is repeated in every home, every church, every city, and you'd be led to imagine that these crimes that are read about on the internet are present around every corner. It's the same kind of spirit that tries to exalt itself by ridiculing others, trying to put others down to make oneself appear to be something. The only people who do that are weak people. And this has become the Christian character in America. You simply label other groups, you accuse every individual of the worst faults that can be found among any group, and you pretend that because you're not in those groups, that you're somehow superior, when your whole life and worldview is based on false accusations, conspiracies, and suspicions without any hard evidence. As I said, I never experienced the mistreatment I talk about until I became a Catholic. And it's because of this faulty Catholic way of living in America, trying to make an excuse for the reality that we're not educated enough or courageous enough or confident enough to actually live as Catholics in a diverse society. I'm afraid that Catholics who don't have my experience outside of Catholic circles don't understand that what I say is true. Many of them are so pessimistic and miserable that I don't think they even know what it's like outside of that little closed-in, miserable, private community. But it's not what the modern Catholics or conservative Christians or even liberal Christians on the opposite side say it is. Life in America is quite good, quite happy, quite enjoyable. And Catholics need to take some time to learn about it. But most importantly for kids, I would say these two important lessons. I want to leave two important lessons that I would like to see Catholic kids raised with in their heads, just pounded into their heads throughout their lives as they grow and study. Number one, you're free to be a Christian in America. You're free. Christianity, like any religion, is welcome in America. And anyone who says anything to the contrary, ask them for proof. You're free to be a Christian, so don't be afraid. Don't be afraid. Don't listen to conspiracy theories. Don't listen to people who raise suspicions about others. Don't listen to people who accuse others of being guilty for things that are done only by a few. Judge people by your actual experience with them. You're free to be a Christian in America. And secondly, what makes you unique? What makes you unique is what makes you valuable. So don't be embarrassed of anything that causes you to differ, unless, of course, it's vice. But anything natural, anything providential, anything circumstantial that causes you to differ, You may consider it to be an obstacle, and it may be an obstacle, but in a diverse society, it's an opportunity for you to distinguish yourself as someone virtuous. One of the stories, I'll share this real quick, one of the stories that inspired me when I was in college, I was in a great university, surrounded by great students. Many of them, their parents were doctors and lawyers. They lived in beautiful neighborhoods in central New Jersey. I was from a working class family that lived in a small neighborhood with working class neighbors. My parents didn't go to college, had no education beyond high school. I was out of place. And I often used to worry about that. A funny story, one day I was leaving class out in the parking lot. I think these things were providential in my life. I drove a car that cost me $400. My uncle was a mechanic. He had a car that he said would run, I could use. I gave him $400 for it. It had this junky old white Mercury Topaz that I drove on campus. And one day after class, I go walking out to my car, and there's a lady in a fur coat with a Mercedes whose car wouldn't start. And I had the opportunity to jump start her Mercedes with my little $400 Mercury Topaz. And that's the lesson. Not to be ashamed of what makes us different, not to be ashamed of our obstacles, but to actually use them as opportunities to do good. But the story that I was telling you before was, I was reading Plutarch's Lives, which virtuous people used to do. I was reading Plutarch's Lives. I was reading the life of Cicero. And Cicero was virtuous and ambitious in a good way. He wanted to get into politics. He wanted to work as a lawyer. But he was from a relatively unknown family. His name, no one knew his name. And so the life of Cicero in Plutarch tells us that Cicero, when he was criticized for the disadvantages of his birth, he responded and said, well, then it's my job to make this name famous. If I was born with a name that doesn't command respect, then I'm going to live a life that causes it to do so. And of course, he made it one of the most famous names in human history. But I had that lesson in my head, and I thought to myself, what for me appears to be a disadvantage, what appears for me to be an obstacle, is actually an opportunity to distinguish myself. And that's what I work to do. And that's what respectable selective schools are looking for. They reward students who do that. They're looking for those stories. They're looking for examples of students who overcome disadvantages. They judge student achievement relative to circumstances. And so those who feel they have disadvantages actually have advantages if they understand them rightly. So those two lessons, kids need to be taught and taught and taught, and it may take time for their parents to learn them themselves, because this is the cause of the fault of the lives of many Catholic parents, Catholic adults. But these two lessons need to really be kneaded into the souls of Catholic kids. Number one, you're free to be a Catholic in America. And number two, what makes you unique, what makes you different, is what actually makes you valuable. I hope that's helpful. God bless.